She adopted a lost wolf pup, never knowing its father was the ruthless Alpha King himself. The mountain village of Caldenwood sat quietly between two ridges of dark pine trees, wrapped in mist most mornings and silence most nights. It was the kind of place where nothing much happened, and that was exactly how Elira Voss liked it. She was 26 years old, a weaver by trade, and she lived alone in a small wooden cottage at the edge of the forest, where the tree line began and the safety of the village ended. Elira's parents had died when she was young, and she had grown used to being alone. She kept a small garden, sold blankets and scarves at the village market, and spent her evenings by the fire with a cup of warm tea. Her life was simple, but it was hers, and she had long since made peace with its quiet rhythm. That peace was broken one cold autumn evening when she heard a strange sound coming from the edge of the woods. It was a thin, trembling cry, almost like a child sobbing, but softer, and edged with something wild. Most people in Caldenwood would have closed their shutters and pretended not to hear it. The forest at night was not a place for curious hearts, but Elira had never been good at ignoring things that needed help. She took a lantern and walked toward the sound, her breath turning to fog in the cold air. Near the roots of a fallen pine tree, she found a small wolf pup, no bigger than a loaf of bread, shivering and tangled in broken branches. Its fur was a strange mix of silver and black, and even in the dim light of her lantern, its eyes glowed with a deep amber color that did not look entirely natural. Elira knew the stories. Everyone in Caldenwood knew them. Somewhere deep in the forest lived a wolf pack ruled by a creature the villagers called the Alpha King, a wolf so large and so fierce that hunters who ventured too far into his territory rarely returned. Just the previous winter, an entire hunting party had vanished near the northern ridge, and the only thing ever found was a torn coat and a broken rifle. Since then, no one dared go near the deep woods, and even the bravest woodsmen gave the forest a wide, respectful distance. Looking at the tiny, shivering pup, Elira found it hard to believe it belonged to anything so terrifying. It looked helpless, cold, and utterly alone, its small body trembling with every breath. Whatever fear she had of wolf legends melted away in that moment. She wrapped the pup in her shawl and carried it home, ignoring the small voice in her head that warned her this was a foolish thing to do. The village elders were not pleased when they learned what she had done. Old Marin, who ran the general store, warned her that raising a wild wolf was inviting disaster into her home. "That creature will grow, Elira," she said, shaking her head. "And when it does, it will remember what it is. Wolves do not forget their nature, no matter how kindly you treat them." But Elira had already made up her mind. She named the pup Ash, for the color of the ashes in her fireplace, where he liked to curl up and sleep. In the weeks that followed, she fed him warm milk from a small bottle, made him a soft bed near the hearth, and spoke to him every day as though he could understand every word she said. To her surprise, he seemed to. Ash was unlike any animal she had ever known. He learned quickly, understood simple commands almost immediately, and seemed to sense her moods before she even expressed them. When she was sad, he would rest his head on her lap and stay there until her mood lifted. When she was busy weaving, he would lie quietly by the window, watching the forest with an intensity that seemed far too serious for a young pup. Months passed, and Ash grew at a startling pace. By midwinter, he was already the size of a full-grown dog, his silver-black coat thick and glossy, his amber eyes sharp and watchful. The villagers who once pitied Elira for her strange choice began to whisper uneasily whenever they saw the two of them walking together. Some avoided her altogether. Others simply watched from a distance, waiting to see how the story would end. Elira paid little attention to the whispers. She had grown to love Ash as one might love a loyal friend, or perhaps even a strange kind of family. She did not know, and could not have known, that far beyond the ridge, in the deepest and darkest part of the forest, something enormous and furious was searching for him. The Alpha King had ruled the forest pack for many years. He was massive, easily twice the size of an ordinary wolf, with fur as black as a moonless night, and eyes that burned amber in the dark. He was feared by every creature in Caldenwood's forest, not because he was cruel without reason, but because he protected what was his with a ferocity that left no room for mercy. Hunters who threatened his pack did not survive the encounter. Predators who wandered too close to his den did not either. Among his entire pack, there was one small member who held a place in his heart that nothing else could touch. His youngest pup, born late in a harsh season, had wandered from the den during a storm many months ago and never returned. The Alpha King had torn through the forest for weeks searching for him, growing more desperate and more dangerous with each passing day that he found no trace of his missing son. He had almost given up hope when, one autumn night, carried on a shifting wind, he caught a scent that made his heart stop. It was faint, and it had traveled a long way, but it was unmistakably familiar. It was the scent of his own blood, mixed strangely with wood smoke and wool. The scent led toward the edge of the forest, toward the small human village that his pack had always avoided. For the first time in a long while, the Alpha King felt something other than cold command settle over him. He gathered a handful of his most trusted wolves and began the long journey toward the village, his mind consumed by only one thought: find his son and destroy anything or anyone who had dared to keep him. Back in Caldenwood, life continued much as it had before, except that Ash had begun acting strangely. On certain nights, he would sit by the window for hours, ears pricked, staring into the darkness of the forest as though listening for something only he could hear. Elira noticed the change, but assumed it was simply part of him growing older, wolves being naturally drawn to the wild places from which they came. She did not know that those nights, faint and distant howls had begun echoing across the ridge, calls that Ash recognized instinctively, calls that spoke of a father who had never stopped searching for him. One evening, as winter's chill deepened and snow began to fall softly over Caldenwood, Elira woke to the sound of Ash growling low in his throat, a sound she had never heard him make before. She rose from her bed and looked out the window, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Surrounding her small cottage, standing silently in the moonlight, was an entire pack of wolves. Their eyes glowed amber in the darkness, and at the very center of them, larger than any creature she had ever imagined, stood a wolf whose black fur seemed to absorb the moonlight itself. She did not need anyone to tell her who he was. She had heard enough stories to know she was looking at the Alpha King himself. Fear gripped her chest, but beneath the fear was something else, a fierce and sudden protectiveness. Ash was pressed close against her leg, his small body trembling, though whether from fear or excitement she could not immediately tell. Whatever happened next, she was not going to let anyone take him without a fight, even if that fight cost her everything. She stepped outside into the snow, her heart pounding, and stood between the pack and the door of her cottage. "If you have come for him," she said, her voice shaking but steady enough to be heard, "you will have to go through me first." The Alpha King's eyes fixed on her, cold and assessing, and for a long moment nothing moved. Then Ash, who had been trembling behind her, suddenly darted forward, not away from the pack, but toward it. He crossed the snow-covered yard in a few quick bounds and pressed himself against the great wolf's side, his tail wagging with unmistakable joy, letting out small, happy sounds that only a reunited family could understand. Elira watched, stunned and confused, as the enormous wolf lowered his head and gently nuzzled the pup, a gesture so tender it seemed impossible coming from a creature the whole village feared. In that moment, she finally understood. Ash was not simply a lost pup she had rescued from the cold. He was the missing son of the very creature every hunter in Caldenwood was terrified to encounter. Her heart sank with dread, certain that the Alpha King would now take his revenge on her for having kept his son, even unknowingly, for so many months. She braced herself, refusing to run, refusing to show the fear that clawed at her chest. But the attack she expected never came. Instead, the great wolf lifted his head and studied her carefully, his amber eyes moving from her face to the small, warm cottage behind her, taking in the modest home where his son had clearly been fed, sheltered, and loved. Slowly, deliberately, the Alpha King lowered his massive head before her, a gesture of respect that stunned every wolf in the pack, and one that no villager in Caldenwood's long history had ever witnessed from him. He seemed to understand, in the way that only a parent could, that this woman had not stolen his son, but had saved his life. She had fed him when he was starving, kept him warm when he was freezing, and loved him without ever asking for anything in return. Whatever fury had driven the Alpha King through the forest for months evaporated in that single, quiet moment, replaced by something that looked almost like gratitude. From that night forward, an unspoken understanding settled over Caldenwood. The wolves no longer avoided the village entirely, and strange as it seemed, they no longer threatened it either. On quiet nights, villagers sometimes caught glimpses of a massive black wolf standing at the edge of the tree line, watching over the small cottage where Elira lived, never approaching, never threatening, simply present, like a silent guardian keeping watch over something precious. Ash continued to live with Elira, growing into a magnificent wolf whose loyalty to her never wavered, even as he grew close enough to his father to slip away into the forest for a few hours at a time, returning always by morning, always eager to curl up by the fire, where he had first found warmth and safety. The village elders, who had once warned Elira so sternly against her foolish kindness, slowly changed their opinions as the seasons passed without incident. Old Marin, in particular, softened the most, often bringing scraps of meat to Elira's cottage under the excuse of checking in, though everyone quietly understood it was her way of showing quiet respect for the woman who had tamed fear itself with nothing more than an open heart. Elira never learned the full truth of what her small act of kindness had prevented. She never knew that her simple decision to carry a shivering pup home on a cold autumn night had likely stopped a war between the forest and the village, a conflict that could have cost countless lives on both sides. She only knew that she had gained a loyal companion, a strange and beautiful creature who loved her fiercely and completely, and who had somehow, without her ever intending it, changed the way an entire village saw the wild world beyond their doors. Years later, when children in Caldenwood asked about the great black wolf sometimes seen at the edge of the forest, the elders would tell them a story, softened by time, but still true in its heart. They spoke of a woman who was not afraid to show kindness, even when fear would have been the easier choice, and of a fierce and terrible king of wolves who had discovered, through her, that mercy could be more powerful than any claw or tooth. And though Elira Voss lived out her days simply, weaving blankets and tending her garden, she remained forever unaware that she had quietly become the one thing the Alpha King now guarded above all else, not out of duty, and not out of fear, but out of a gratitude too deep for words, carried silently through every season, in every glance from the tree line, for as long as she lived.